Good Friday morning, everyone, and welcome to today's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. If you're joining me for the very first time, I do this on a weekly basis and talk about how I've taken some of the lessons that I've learned from both my customers, my consulting clients in the field, and also my previous experiences working as a SQL Server DBA, as a consultant as well. And all in the context of SQL Server high availability and not just focusing on the technology aspect, but also focusing on how to make it practical, how we can make your high availability and disaster recovery solutions not just practical and pragmatic, but something that you can take action on. This month's theme revolves around backups, and what's really interesting is I uh, I went back to the public library, which is interesting because for one, with all the uh, digital books, I listen a lot to audiobooks, especially when I travel, and it's kind of hard carrying books around when you're traveling. So I ended up, I think it was back in 2008 or 2009 when I shifted to digital books or ebooks from with Amazon Kindle, PDFs, and reading all of that. But then I kind of still like the smell of books, the paper, when you turn the pages around and feel the texture of the cover. Uh, it's I don't know, it's a totally different experience. And though every once in a while I will still grab a paper bound or paperback or a hardbound book that I would use. And I have not been to the public library, I think, for the past 10 years now. The last time I did was 2009. That was the last time I went to the public library. So I figured, why not? Let's go try. Applied for my library card, sign up, and then went to the library and grab this book, Chicken Soup for the Soul. This reminded me of the very first book that I bought for myself. I was in high school, and the very first book that I bought for myself was a copy of the very first edition of the Chicken Soup for the Soul. And it's interesting. I think I've read at this point. I've read around 7 or 8 of these, meaning the first serving, the second serving, all of that. And then they had a series of different themes, like for instance, chicken soup for the moms, chicken soup for the grieving soul, chicken soup for and lo and behold, I just found something that's specifically for Canadians. But this one caught my attention. Laughter is the best medicine. 101 feel good stories about laughter. And unlike the other books, other chicken soup book series, this is literally all just about storytelling to make people laugh. No lessons, nothing. It isn't like one of those, yeah, you read a good story and then you learn something and then there's a lesson. This one's really just about laughing. And I kind of reminded myself of some of the mistakes that I made. Uh, and that's literally the topic of today's conversation. The three biggest blunders for my botched backups. Again, keeping with the theme of this month's topic, which is all about backups. And interestingly, there's a lot of stories that I remember from the days back when I was working as a data center engineer, as a SQL Server DBA, as an operational guy. And a lot of the things that I do today were a byproduct of the mistakes that I made. Now, growing up in a culture where you're being told, you're not supposed to be making mistakes, you're supposed to be calculating every move, you got to plan everything. This is kind of unusual. And I like talking about my mistakes because, for one, if it helps someone out there avoid my mistakes, the better, right? Uh, of course, I wasn't proud of that back when I was in university, especially when you look at your university transcript and you have like 17 failed courses. Now, I brag about the fact that I failed 17 courses in my undergrad. Uh, and I want to talk about three biggest mistakes or biggest. I intentionally look for words that I can use to make the title a little bit more catchy. Three biggest blunders, and actually, these are not the biggest. These are just the ones that um, emphasize some of the lessons that you can take away from these that actually made the most impact. And here's one of the things that you would hear from most IT professionals, if you have, whether you're a sysadmin or a DBA, if you have not made a serious mistake in your entire career, then you haven't made it yet, meaning you have not literally earned your battle scars. And that is not to say that you have to intentionally make mistakes, especially in production environment where you would affect catastrophic issues or serious damages to the business or to your company. But there's also a lot of these uh, new information coming in, specifically from new technologies, new versions of SQL Server or Windows, specifically if you're looking at implementing high availability and disaster recovery solutions on the Microsoft platform. There will always be these new technologies and new features. And if you're learning the technology for the first time, because it is part of your job, you're mostly in tune and you're seeking for guidance on how to do things, but rarely you would hear people tell you what not to do, right? It's almost always about what to do versus what not to do. And again, because it's most of the time we chastise mistakes, like we call it out, we discourage people from making mistakes. I know I was told that more than 1,000 times, where it's wrong to make mistakes, but I started reframing it as a learning opportunity. Like, like I said, the goal is not for you to intentionally make mistakes in a production environment, but rather try and test out anything that could potentially break in a safe environment, in a lab environment. And like I said, these three lessons are the things that pop up because, for one, they almost ended up in an RGE, or a resume generating event. Plus, they also combine a lot of the lessons that you can also learn um, while uh, being more intentional about the things that you do, particularly in the case of backup. Because again, whether we believe it or not, whether you want to accept it or not, we still have backups. We're still doing backups, and you are going to need backups, whether you're putting stuff on the cloud. Interestingly, Azure SQL DB, there will be a lot of questions about, so how do we restore from backups? Well, it's on the cloud. The cloud provider is supposed to do that, right? But no, it is going to be here for the rest of probably our lives, taking care of how we can restore from backups, because it's just the nature of the industry, right? So grab your pen and paper ready. This is kind of like more of a storytelling plus lessons. The first lesson, my biggest blunders, is being overly confident with backups. This was, oh, and by the way, a lot of these happened more than 15 years ago. Like I said, majority of the things that I do today were influenced by these mistakes. Even the best practices and the opinions that I have as far as the way I do things. So the first one is being overly confident with backups. You probably heard me say, if you've been following along and you've watched some of the videos that I've done in the past, you probably heard me say a lot of times, I don't believe in backups, right? I don't believe in backups. And it's kind of controversial because I just mentioned earlier, we need backups. I just don't believe in backups alone. And what I mean by that is, what I believe in is, I believe in the ability to successfully restore from a backup. And I have been bitten by this so many times. In fact, the very first time um, I had this was, more than 15 years ago now. We were slowly moving into the virtualization um, thingy, right? I was working as a data center engineer, and majority, about 80% of our deployments are all on physical machines. Unix, Windows, everything physical, until we started testing out VMware. And if I were a database administrator, I have to take care of the underlying database. But this virtualization is a new thing, right? We've done things in the past as far as how we do things with database backups. We take database backups, use SQL Server, run a backup database command. use database maintenance plans. Back then, there was no such thing as the Ola Hallengren scripts. We did what we did until this new virtualization thing came around. So we started putting stuff in our virtualization platform, small database servers. Back then it was 2000 and 2005. We started putting them there. And then we are in the process of creating a kind of like a streamlined approach on how we would deal with backups for this new infrastructure. Because for one, we were told, yeah, the VM will be taking care of everything. Just take a snapshot, everything would be good, right? And I was a little bit doubtful, but I haven't worked with VMware back then, and so I'll throw anything at me. So the lead engineer who's responsible for migrating from physical to virtual set everything up. Now we have about 5 SQL Server instances running on VMware. And one of the tasks that need to be done is to take a backup of the database and move it to a totally different machine. Now, this is not a P2V, it's more of like a V2V, right? We're migrating from VMware to another VMware host. And in the back of my mind, I was thinking, well, this is probably the best time to test whether or not this works. And so I let the lead engineer who's taking care of the virtualization platform do the entire V2V, meaning he would take the VM running SQL Server from the existing platform and move it to a new platform. Okay, I'll hand it over to you. My assumption was he's got it covered. He told me that the snapshots would be enough. And because of how he described the snapshots to me, I was thinking, okay, the database would look exactly like how how they would look like when the snapshot was taken, right? Just like what we are doing today with whatever third-party utility that you're using. He took a snapshot, restored it, provisioned additional storage. Lo and behold, we could not restart the VM, right? We could not start the VM. Now, I was a data center engineer slash DBA back then. My responsibility is limited to the SQL Server instance, meaning I do not have access to, well, I do have access to the Windows Server operating system, but I do not have access to the VMware infrastructure. That's the lead engineer's responsibility. So my hands are tied, right? He was doing this, I don't want to say migration because part of that is really testing. We were taking a VM from an existing VM host to another VM host just to come up with a new process for DR and for business continuity, but then it didn't work. This ties up to what I started with earlier when I said I don't really believe in backups. I believe in successfully testing restores or successfully being able to restore from your backups. Because what good are your backups if you can't restore from them? And this happened about 15, 16 years ago, and it has literally influenced everything that I do when it comes to backups. In fact, one of the reasons why I said I don't really believe in backups anymore, I believe in successfully being able to restore from backups. And it is not specifically a SQL Server thing, which means when I look at it, well, it's not my responsibility because the issue happened on the hypervisor layer. It happened on a scope of responsibility that I don't have access to. But the thing is, I am supposed to be responsible for the database. So even if it's a 5 megabyte database or a 5 terabyte database, the reality is whatever is inside of VM, I'm responsible for, but I overly, I became overly confident about the fact that the VMs are good enough, the snapshots are good enough. And it's quite interesting because it wasn't a mistake on my end, it's a mistake on everybody's end. It's also not a resume generating event because one, we are creating a new business continuity plan, a new DR plan. So this is something that we really had to do. The good thing about it is I, I learned from that mistake. It's one of those things where today's technology, where you're using third-party tools like Veeam or um, some of the excuse me DR strategies like Nutanix or Nutanix is a hyperconverged platform. What was I thinking about? The other thing that is used for DR. The interesting thing about this is those same challenges that people who are implementing third-party backup tools that integrate with VMs, that integrate with a SQL Server, are the very same challenges that happened before. And it's also one of the reasons why I'm sharing a lot of these blunder stories, because we're solving the same challenges. They just look a little bit different, right? Back then, we were just using the native tools built into VMware when we're taking VM snapshots and copying them around. I remember, I think it was fast. No, I forget. But this is one of those things where the same challenges that we are solving today are literally the same ones that we have experienced 15, 20 years ago. They just look a little bit different. And that's one of the reasons why when somebody wants to implement something like a standardized enterprise backup, I would try as much as possible to understand how the enterprise backup works, right? Whether you're using TSM from IBM, where they have the agents, and what are you using that, or using Veeam, for instance, or you are using any of those third-party enterprise backups that you integrate with SQL Server, the first thing that I would do is I would try and understand what it is doing. Are you running an agent? And if you're running an agent, how is the agent taking backups of the database? Is it quiescing the database files? Is it freezing the IO? What is it doing? The second thing that I would try to understand is what happens after it takes the backup. Does it keep it locally? Does it stream it to a network attached storage or any network storage? And then what else does it do? And the third thing that I would ask is, how do I restore from that backup? If it's an enterprise backup and I have no clue at all, if again, putting on the hat of a database administrator, if I do not have any clue at all on how to restore from that backup, I'm already toast. Because for one, how would I do my work if I don't know how this thing works, right? So again, it's a lot of these fall under segregation of duties, especially for large enterprises. But if somebody would say, we'll take care of it, the first thing that I would have to do is to see it for myself, how they would do it. And of course, part of that is also timing the process, because timing the process is measuring against your recovery time objective. They would say we'll take a snapshot of the VM, or it really doesn't matter if it's a snapshot of the entire VM or a snapshot of the database, because sometimes it's an agent and they would take a snapshot. How do they take that? And that's why it really pays to understand what a third-party backup or the enterprise backup is doing, and putting yourself in the picture of how that works. It's also interesting because sometimes when the backup administrator or the sysadmins, again, I'm looking at large companies where you have segregation of duties. Your Windows team is responsible for anything Windows, and then the DBA team is responsible from the SQL Server instance down to indexes and data. And then there's the hypervisor team, and then there's the backup team. Everybody is involved. Because for one, how do I run SQL Server if, number one, I don't have an operating system? Oh, and by the way, if they're running on VM, how will I be able, or how will the Windows people be able to install Windows or operating system if there was no VM? And how would the VM guys be able to provision a VM if there was no storage? Oh, and by the way, how do we all do our work if there's no available storage? See, and this is one of those things where I really got to think about HA and DR, and even backups, as simple as backups are, is a team sport. So understanding that you cannot just be overly confident with just having backups. I know I spent a lot of time on that because um, sometimes you end up becoming the accidental DBA or the person in charge of SQL Server just because you know a little bit of SQL Server, and nobody in the company knows anything. So now you're being given this responsibility, and you're a sysadmin, and I'm like, okay, I'll just do what you know we've been doing as far as enterprise backups are concerned. But becoming overly confident with backups and not having a process to actually restore from wherever that backup lands and successfully restoring it is a recipe for disaster. That's just one. Like I said, I probably got a dozen of these stories. The second one is this one's funny and nerve-wracking at the same time. Not an RJE, not a resume generating event, but it's nerve-wracking and it's scary because I was in front of 400 plus people while this was happening. I was doing a presentation, I think in 2009. This was the largest Microsoft conference in Southeast Asia back then. And the topic that I specifically chose was database recovery techniques. Database recovery techniques. I was trying to show people how you can recover from any type of database disasters. Recovery. And whenever I do presentations, a lot of the time people ask me, so do you just have a demo, or do you? A lot of the times when I do presentations, it's all scripted. And what I mean scripted, imagine watching a movie, you think you're immersed in the movie. There's a story, there's an outline, there's a framework, there's a script. The actor is acting off of a script. And that's what I do with my presentations. For one of the reasons I do that is because I want to make sure that I am within the time that was allocated to me. If I was given an hour, I'm not going to go hour and 10. They only gave me an hour. This is in utter respect for the next presenter or the next speaker, plus also setting the expectations that this is exactly what's going to do. And again, maybe because I did theater back then, not something that I want to go back to again. But I try as much as possible to come up with a script in order to plan everything. And not only that, if you're doing a demo, you gotta understand what your capabilities are, meaning what your machine is capable of, what demos you're gonna show, what capabilities that you're gonna show, and all of these are wrapped around stories. I didn't realize I've been telling stories all the time. So I show different disaster recovery techniques. In fact, you would find a recording of a video that I did from like 10 years ago on the database recovery techniques to keep handy on my YouTube channel. Go watch it. But that was a byproduct of that. So I was showcasing how you can recover from a corrupt or a lost data file. I was showing how you can recover from a damaged storage media. Because for one, your database files are sitting on a storage media, whether that's SSD or a tiered storage or rotating disk. It's still sitting on a storage media, and you don't know when that is going to break. It's one of the reasons why, even if you're running on SSDs, you need RAID 5. And it's not an excuse where people would say, oh, I've got AGs and I've got backups. I don't need RAID 5. This is, again, one of those things where if you throw everything to the cloud, they'll take care of it, but then you no longer have an understanding of what risks are. So I was showing a lot of these examples on what you can do to mitigate stuff like this. So for instance, you lose one drive, how do you recover from that? One big, and here's the thing, like I said earlier, is that I have a script. When you're doing a disaster recovery process, you have a disaster recovery document. And the second lesson here is not following my own DR processes. I have a script. I have everything written down. Like, this is my first step. This is what I'm going to show. This is the second step. This is what I'm going to show. This is the third step, and this is what I'm going to show. In a DR exercise, and I say exercise because you don't want to be exercising, or you don't want to be practicing DR in a real disaster. That in itself is a lesson. You don't want to be doing disaster recovery exercises when your databases are down. No, you should be practicing before it happens. So in my case, I had everything rehearsed. Think of my entire script, and I'm not talking about, the T-SQL scripts or Power. No, I'm talking about how I would do everything to the dot, by the minute, from start to finish. Why is that? Because whatever it is that I'm doing in step 5 is directly influenced what I'm doing in step 3, right? What I'm doing in step 4 is directly influenced with what I'm doing in step 1. This is in itself a lesson. Don't wing it, right? Create a disaster recovery document. How are you going to recover from database corruption if it only happens on one of the databases in your availability group? Let's assume that your database is in an availability group. Oh yeah, we got automatic page repair will take care of that. Well, let's assume that before you put the database in an availability group, you already have corruption. How do you recover from that? You need to have a DR process. So let me go back to the story. I was doing this. I was showcasing disaster recovery techniques, and I've got my backups, meaning demo number 1, this is exactly what I'm going to be doing. I'm going to be using this backup, and this is the process how I would be restoring from backups and showcasing that I can get back to the state of the database before the corruption happened. And I literally have a timer to show them this is how long it is going to take. Imagine if I wasn't even talking, this is how long this is going to take, right? So everything's scripted, but then I improvised. I love improvising because I'm a musician, and sometimes when you're playing jazz music, you kind of like to improvise, not in a DR exercise, not in a DR exercise, not in a real disaster. Okay, this was not a real disaster. This was a presentation in front of 400 people in the largest conference, Microsoft Tech conference in Southeast Asia. Step number 5, I could not recover from backup because I literally overwrote the backup that I was supposed to use for step number 5. Okay, I got everything all figured out. I have everything scripted. I have everything to the dot, what to do, how to do it, step 1, step 2, up to step 5. Step number 4 required taking a backup. I accidentally overwrote the backup that I was supposed to be using that came from step 1. And when you're in front of 400 people, it's different because all 400, all 800 eyes are on you, watching you how to do this. And I knew at the back of my head there was no getting out of that situation. They knew, the entire audience knew that I really screwed up, and I ended the presentation. It's a good thing because it's in the last piece. It's a good thing because I'm almost done, and I ended the presentation by saying, and that is exactly how not to do this, where you're improvising and not following your disaster recovery process. Again, highlighting the fact that number 1, you need to have a disaster recovery process. What happens if somebody dropped a table? How do you recover? Do you have a backup? Do you know exactly what to do with your backups? Are you going to take them, restore them, or do you even have the right skills to take your backup, restore, and only affect few data pages? I'm talking about page level restore here. The thing about this is because I went off script, I improvised, it cost me a lot. And that's one, and of course the entire room bursted out in laughter. I was crying inside because I was putting up a fake smile, of course. 400 people seeing right before their very eyes a disaster that just happened, which is ironically a topic about how to recover from database disasters. Again, if you're interested in the SQL Server aspect of that and technical details of that, go look it up on my YouTube channel. But the thing about that again is one of the reasons why it struck me is because one, I still see a lot of customers who, number one, do not have a DR strategy. They're winging it. Oh, we have backups, but what happens if you lose your entire data center? Oh, we got a third-party tool. Have you tested it? Going back to point number one, or mistake number one, where I overly trusted the backup and not tested it and not documented it, right? Anything can happen, especially in a real disaster. Because in a real disaster, in fact, I had everything. I got my backups, I got my DR process, I rehearsed it so many times. But the one thing that, again, the one thing that that mistake taught me was that you can have everything that you need, the backups that you need, the DR strategy that you need. You may have all of these, but the state of mind in a real disaster matters more than all of these things, right? And I could have fixed it right there and then. It would take me an additional 20 plus minutes. You might be thinking, oh, 20 minutes, what's 20 minutes? Well, 20 minutes that I don't have now because I'm 5 minutes before the end of my presentation. And that's why I took the lessons from that, aside from the humiliation about myself, crying inside because everybody saw me making a blunder in front of 400 plus people. I took the lesson and I made sure that I incorporate it even in the way that I do my disaster recovery processes, even if it's as simple as a backup, which leads me to my third mistake. Third mistake is entrusting the process to untrained or unavailable personnel. If you look at that experience with me presenting in front of 400 plus people, I was a trained professional. I was available. I was the one actually doing it. I wrote the process. I executed the process. I timed the process. And I did it, I think, about 4 or 5 times until I know I'm very confident I can do it with my eyes closed. And then I close my eyes. The third mistake is entrusting the entire process to untrained or unavailable personnel. This happened in the same time frame when I was still working as a data center engineer. We were level 3 engineers, meaning we have level 1 who are people who are taking care of the tickets as they come in, and then level 2 engineers who would be looking at the tickets, evaluating and seeing whether or not they could immediately fix it, and then level 3s when the level 2 people can't fix it, things get escalated to you. I assumed, based on their experiences and their technical expertise, that they can actually do the work. I was on call. Unfortunately, I was not in the country. I was also on a different time zone. And when you are entrusting a mission critical process to somebody, you have to make sure that they are trained, meaning they know exactly how to do it, and they are in the right state of mind when they're doing it, meaning, well, you got to have a DR process in place. What happens when, right? They're going to have to do this. And they have to be available. I mean, what good is a DR process if nobody, and literally nobody, is available to actually do it. My mistake was I kind of assumed, going back to mistake number one, where I was being overly confident with the backup. Here, I'm being overly confident with the people and assuming that they know how to do the job and or they're available. In the available case, that was me. I got a I don't want to say a call, an email, and the good thing about that is it happened. It happened in I think about the middle of the night, local time, and I was in North American time zone. I saw the email come in, but I was nowhere near the server where I could. And of course, back then, of course, we already had VPN, but I needed to act fast. I was not in a place where I have internet connection, but I was trusting the operational people, the level two people, to actually fix the problem. We had a patching process go south, and now we had to rebuild the entire server, right? The good thing about that is it was on a weekend. We had an entire weekend available to us, meaning for this particular server, we can afford to have we can afford to have an entire weekend unavailable between Saturday 12 in the morning up until like Sunday 9 p.m. We had that time frame, but again, nobody from the level two engineers can restore the database backups. Uh, there were level three engineers who can rebuild the machine because, again, we were moving into virtualization, spin up a VM, install Windows, and that's it. I had to be the one responsible for taking care of installing SQL Server and restoring from backups. Again, I assumed level two engineers will be able to do what I can do without validating whether or not they can really do it. They couldn't. And so 24/7, I was interacting with the engineers from the other side of the globe. We were on conference call. Took me a while before I could find a place where I could have an internet connection, connect to the VPN, and then started talking to the people who are level two engineers. But the thing is, again, my mistake was I assumed that in cases like these, and because, well, we have a team of 5 who are level 3 engineers for anything Windows and SQL Server, I forgot that I was the only SQL Server person there. And I assumed that the level 2 people can do a little bit of what the level 3 people can do. Uh, I was wrong. You can have the best DR strategy. You can have a proper DR documentation written down, right? A proper documentation written down. Step 1, this is what you do. Step 2, this is what you do. Up to the point where you're restoring databases from backups and everything is successful. And you probably heard a lot of people say this. If you're writing technical documentation, let the most senior engineer write it, but let the most junior engineer follow through it so that we can see the gaps between what the most junior engineer can or cannot do, and then we start improving the document. That was my mistake. My mistake was, well, I wrote the document with me in mind, not realizing that the people who would execute the document do not have my expertise. They're not trained. And number 2, I was supposed to be available, but I wasn't. So that third mistake is really entrusting the entire process of DR process to untrained and unavailable personnel. This is one of the reasons why today, even when clients would come to me and say, hey, we want to build a high availability solution, and I know we're talking about backups here, but it applies to just about anything. Oh, we're going to be implementing this backup solution. Well, who within the database team knows how this backup solution works? Nobody. Well, you got to make sure you know how to use it first before you even use it. Same thing. When a customer would come to me and say, we want to implement an AG, we want to have a multi-site cluster and this and that. And first question I ask is, well, how many people on your team know how to do this? One? Well, even if it's one person, what are you going to do if that person becomes unavailable because he went on vacation, he got sick, he decided to retire or quit the job? What are you going to do? Right? It's all of these, and that's one of the reasons I said everything. A lot of the things that I do today were influenced by these mistakes, because I'm pretty sure you've been in that on that side of the fence where you're trying to figure out, hey, where is my internet connection? Well, good thing nowadays you can hop onto a um, a Starbucks store, connect to their Wi-Fi, and then connect your VPN. Maybe you can get one of those uh, um, portable Wi-Fi devices, or you can uh, tether your laptop to your phone. But back in those days, I'm at the mercy of the next available Wi-Fi hotspot, right? A lot of the things that I'm doing today were influenced by these mistakes, and hopefully, as I'm sharing these personal stories, that uh, you implement a solution where, number one, you're not being overly confident with backups, even if the backup engineer or whoever's responsible of the backup say, "Oh, we got you covered." I'm not saying don't take their word for it. I'm just saying, show me, because there is no question about whether or not you can do it if you can actually show me, and we are meeting our recovery time objectives, right? Don't be too overly confident with your backups. Do not um, I want to say improvise. Do not improvise on your DR documents or your DR processes, which also goes to say you need to have a DR process. Write it down, rehearse it, practice it, because even when you're doing that, where you're writing the documentation, rehearsing it, doing regular DR exercises, there is no telling what is going to happen in a real disaster event. And number three, of course, don't entrust don't entrust the entire DR process to untrained people, or even worse, unavailable people. That's about it. I got more. I actually got more stories because, again, this is one of those things where I'm not telling you to intentionally make mistakes in production environment. Build a lab, test out all of these things, break your lab, because nobody's going to be screaming at you when you break something in your lab. And you can try all of these things, right? Write your own DR document, streamline your process, test it in your lab and see if it works. And then test it in the production environment. Okay, you can afford to make mistakes in a lab environment, right? And sharing these mistakes also will give you some insights as to what not to do, instead of just relying on someone who just told you, yeah, this works. Okay, show me. Right? Tune in again. And that's, if you want, I could share more stories that I could think of. That time when I crashed an entire server because I forgot that it was supposed to be deployed on a totally different network, and I deployed it in production. Tune in again for another topic of conversation next week. We're still in the topic of backups. The theme for this whole month is all about backups. Tune in again next week for another topic. And if you need any help with implementing not just a backup solution, because backup solutions is easy, but when you start combining your backup solutions with HA, like an always on availability groups, and you don't have an existing DR process, and you need someone to reevaluate whether or not your existing DR solutions, your existing backup solutions, or even if you don't have one yet, use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy call. Let's have that conversation. I'm happy to help in any way I can. If I'm the right person to help, I'm more than happy to do that. If not, I will steer you in the direction that would help serve you best. Again, use that link on the screen, schedule a strategy session. This will redirect you to my calendar page where you can pick and choose the time that works for you, right? And then uh, we'll hop on a call and have that conversation. All right, and that's about it for this week's episode of the Practical SQL Server HA show. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Make sure that your backups are actually working. Don't rely on verify only. I don't know. It just pop out of nowhere. Don't rely on restore, verify only to check whether or not your backups work. Restore them, test them, make it work. Enjoy the rest of your weekend. Goodbye.